perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's a weighty call. It's the highest of standards. Be perfect. That's not a phrase that's usually depicted on the hanging wooden wall art. You're the ones I'm talking about. They're kind of like plaques, and the art ranges from the sharing of family rules, be kind, laugh, be honest, to the humorous, like the one I saw just this week, whose message is, don't be a stinker today. I will confess that may be slightly edited, but still a reminder we all probably need from time to time. But rarely, if ever, do we choose to place on our walls the reminder to be perfect. As individuals in our vocations or when it comes to our health, as households, as families, as partners, as parents, as children, the standard of perfection can be a damaging one. Striving for perfection, our own perceived idea of what perfection is, and the ideas that society and culture impress upon us, can set us up for an endless cycle of shame and guilt and discouragement. Not to mention the tension we feel in having to display and defend our perfection to others. This is all to say that when we heard that verse read today, the one that says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect, it's okay if we squirmed a little bit. It's okay if hearing that expectation made us uncomfortable. It's okay that now realizing that this is where the sermon is going to focus, that we're maybe starting to squirm even a bit more. Because the ideal of perfection has perhaps been nowhere more abused than in faith communities. The cycle of shame, guilt, and discouragement in the face of perfection is only amplified when we're told or feel that the one doing the shaming, the one who is most disappointed in our falling short, is the very one who created us, who redeemed us, and who sustains us still. The church, the big C church, the universal church, has inflicted a lot of hurt by displaying the be perfect wall hanging. The church has historically held up be perfect while failing as a community through prayer and discernment and reflection to hold ourselves accountable to the same standard. And the hurt caused by this has fallen predominantly on those whom Jesus held closest. The ones on the margins, the ones with whom no one else wants to break bread. To put it crassly, the church has just often been a stinker. And I can assure you, now having used that word twice in this sermon, that I am falling far short of the standard of perfection held up for any student of preaching and homiletics, and it is going to show up again. So with all of this discomfort and tension hanging in the air, what do we do? What do we do with these words from Jesus' own mouth? Be perfect. First, to set the scene here, we need to remember that Jesus is preaching. And of course, Jesus preached often to 2 or 3 gathered, to his disciples, in his actions. But here, Jesus is preaching. This is the Sermon on the Mount. The crowd is gathered, and Jesus began his message with the Beatitudes and still has much to share. So this command, this directive, this charge to be perfect, it's not a throwaway line. And we've already talked about how the church has inflicted much hurt by applying a standard of perfection that seems to ostracize all of those whom Jesus counted as friends and beloveds. So there's something else going on here, some other idea of perfection. This passage begins with one of the most frequent phrases in the Gospel of Matthew. You have heard that it was said. And at those words, all of the blinking alarms and bells should be going off. You have heard that it was said. You better know your Hebrew scriptures. Jesus did. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the prophets. You better know them. Because how else will you have heard that it was said? You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. From Exodus to Leviticus to the reading we have this morning from the book of Deuteronomy, we hear the echo, the call and the commandment to love our neighbor. And then here's where it gets a little messy. There is no scriptural account, no verse to point to that says you shall hate. You shall hate your enemy. But it doesn't take much imagination for us to put on the fabric of what it is to be human. Do you think we can do it for a minute? Imagine what it is to be human? I think we can. And so the extrapolation, that human understanding of love your neighbor, makes sense at face value, right? I will love my neighbor as I am commanded. But then, because we're human, just like the be perfect that goes up on the wall, we're going to post who it is that is our neighbor. Anyone not on the list is our enemy and shall be hated with the same commitment and vengeance that we love those whom we consider to be our neighbors. That's not found in our holy scriptures. It's not part of the law as given by God to God's people at Sinai and in the wilderness. But wow, do we know and understand and feel that as part of our human lived experience. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. The people of Jesus' day understood and knew and felt that too. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies. And pray for those who persecute you. Love and pray. In these actions, in love and in prayer, be perfect. Love and pray for your neighbor. And we, as the Church of the Good Samaritan, know that when someone asks Jesus, and who is my neighbor? That the response includes everyone, or as we say in the South, all y'all. Everyone. The Samaritan, the tax collector, the Gentile, especially as we're reminded today in Deuteronomy, the orphan and the widow and the stranger. To all these, to all y'all, in love and in prayer, be perfect. And then there's that other part. Not just be perfect, but be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Perfection that reflects nothing less than God. And here, let's be really clear that we're not being called to be God. Talk about a standard of perfection that sets us up for failure before we've ever begun. We are not called to be God, to duplicate God's perfection. In our human frailty and limitation, we are called to reflect God's perfection. God, whose love is perfect. And we might think about love here not as an emotion, but as a steadfast, rock-hard loyalty. A loyalty that cannot be shaken through a cycle of shame and guilt and discouragement. It's just there, perfect. So God is perfect in God's loyalty to us. The reading from Deuteronomy today comes after one of the more infamous stories of God's people in the wilderness. The story of the golden calf. Moses has been up on the mountain with God, receiving the covenant to give to the people, and as he comes back down the mountain, there it is, the image of the golden calf. The people had grown impatient in Moses' absence and became convinced that God who had rescued them from Egypt and was still, even this day, feeding them in the wilderness with manna from heaven, that God had abandoned them. So they took matters into their own hands, literally, and crafted a God that they thought worthy of themselves. And this pattern, by the way, was not a new one. The golden calf was not the first time that the people questioned God's love, questioned God's loyalty, and walked a different path. But every time the people turned away, every time they acted like stinkers, God's loyalty was constant. God's love was perfect, and every time, again, not through shame and not through guilt, but every time the people were again given the opportunity to reflect something of God's loyalty into the world. The words we hear today in Deuteronomy are after the covenant has been renewed. After God has again shown what perfection looks like. Love in action, perfect loyalty. Perfection that is not about shame or guilt or discouragement, but perfection that is about abundance. Even when there is judgment, still abundant love and loyalty. Abundant compassion, abundant mercy, abundant grace. Love and pray for all y'all. Love and pray for everyone, and be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. This is the call for all Jesus followers. Be perfect in loyalty and love and prayer to your neighbor. As Christians who today celebrate our nation's Independence Day, we have the opportunity to contemplate again the freedom we have to be perfect in loyalty, in love, and in prayer, to renew our zeal for justice and to practice the strength of forbearance. Our neighbors desire nothing less, and our perfect God requires nothing more.